In recent months, Judy had lost sleep. In the evening, she felt so exhausted that she fell into a black nothingness as soon as she pulled the covers over her. But at the second hour of the night, at the deepest, most hopeless time of the night, when the morning is still so far away, and it seems as if the dawn will never come, she would wake up and could not sleep again. She was in pain, a lot of pain. Everything from her soul to her fingertips ached. She wanted to howl, and she would have done so, forgetting about the neighbors, if she hadn't realized that the howling wouldn't make her feel any better. She wandered to the kitchen, shook a couple of antidepressant pills out of the box, and put them in the palm of her hand, drank them first with water, and then, spitting on caution, added something stronger, 30 degrees or so, although all the accompanying documents strictly forbade mixing medicines and alcohol. After a while, I managed to forget myself with an unhealthy, heavy sleep. And then the alarm clock rang right away, at the same second. And it was necessary to get up, to sweep herself into a heap. Exactly the fragments, if they were all collected, could be folded into what used to be her life. For the first time, she was afraid to sleep. Having somehow got used to the idea that her husband and daughter were dead during the day, she was afraid to see them alive in her dreams, to believe it, and when she woke up, to relive the horror and bitterness of the loss. It was beyond the power of a mere mortal. With this insomnia that came to her immediately after the funeral, she brought herself to complete exhaustion. It ended in her mother-in-law's promise, no offense, to turn her over to that institution, which is popularly called, briefly and simply, Judy wouldn't take those words from anyone but Angie. But her mother-in-law was on the same page. She had lost her only son and granddaughter. Her own husband was broken by this grief, and Anna Sergeyevna had to support both him and Judy, for her mother-in-law had seemed too harsh. The young woman had not yet had the wisdom to realize that Angie's hard life had made her like that. She had never had the opportunity to delegate her duties to someone else and remain tender, and that hardening, over the years, became Angie's pillar of support in the worst of her ordeal. Judy saw later. She was shown pictures, a Renault truck smash into their Audi on a flat road. The car was wrecked in such a way that the only strange thing was that Lillian was still alive for a while. Mike died instantly. His body was not immediately removed from the mangled car, and her daughter was still breathing, waiting for the ambulance, which arrived a quarter of an hour later and held almost until the hospital, meaning the last time the girl breathed when the ambulance was already driving into the medical center. Medics then said that the girl had no chances and maybe it would have been better if at once. If there had not been in her life this last agonizing hour, that first night, left forever alone, having lost her own, Judy spent very strangely. Perhaps it was then that her mother-in-law first thought that her daughter-in-law had lost her mind. In her mind, Judy knew that friends and distant relatives would want to support, but the only thing she craved at this moment was solitude. She couldn't bear to be around anyone else. She locked the door, turned out the lights in the apartment, grabbed a small laptop, sat down in her bedroom right on the carpet so she couldn't see from the street that anyone was in the apartment, and started watching a movie. It was a strange cliffhanger, fantastic in the intensity of the pain of the movie to live. It intertwined the fates of people who had lost their nearest and dearest. Someone was able to survive the loss, and when the tape reached the moment when the heroine at the funeral suddenly smiles at the inordinate suffering, that's when only Judy was able to cry. Not some acquaintances, but Art gave her a shoulder that terrible evening. The next day, Angie arrived in the morning, and a whirlwind of funeral-related worries began, worries from which one could not get out before the wake was over. In both the church and the cemetery, her mother-in-law was there, all in black, from her headscarf to her shoes. She stood still, and Judy clung to her like a rock. She might not have lasted the rest of the ceremony if she hadn't had that support, but she had a soul mate in this grief, another orphaned mother, and leaning on her hand, Judy endured until the wooden cross, shared by father and daughter, was placed over the grave, and everyone began to board the bus and get into cars to go to the cafe for the wake. And then, when everyone had gone, the mother-in-law dropped her head on the table in the half-dark hall and cried so bitterly and so muffled, as if it were not sobs, but a cough that choked her. But only once in her life had Judy ever seen her mother-in-law cry. After that, Angie called her often to support her or just to see how Judy was feeling. She was the first to notice that the young woman had turned black gaunt and had an unhealthy, crazy gleam in her eyes. Then her mother-in-law came to her home with the doctor, who, to be honest, was not at all happy about such a patient. "Actually, I have no right," he said. "It's a complicated case. It's better in a hospital, or I'll prescribe you a treatment, and you may not know what you're thinking. Drugs do not work immediately, cumulatively." "That's what," said mother-in-law, running her palm on the table, wiping off invisible crumbs. "Only you yourself now realize how bad you are. If you feel you can't cope on your own, let's get you admitted to the hospital right away, or you can try to fight. We still have a lot to do. A monument to them, to memorialize them. Nobody's gonna do that for us." Judy nodded, tears running down her cheeks. The doctor wrote a prescription and said that first of all, the patient should get a good sleep. Then it will be possible to think about further recovery. But otherwise, from then on, Judy did not live, but existed. She regularly took the medicines prescribed by the doctor, slept a little, worked a little. It was good that her mother-in-law did not demand more. She realized that too little time had passed and the wound was still quite fresh. Still, she wouldn't leave her daughter-in-law, realizing there was no one else to take care of Judy. "You ought to think of yourself," Judy said to her once. "Oh, Mike can see you suffering from up there," she said. "He won't forgive me if I don't try to comfort you." So this morning she called to ask, "Hey, how are you?" "Oh, they're sending me on a business trip," Judy said, "for a few days. I've got to pull myself together, but where will I get the strength?" She'd been a journalist, and not only had business trips been the order of the day, but sometimes she'd volunteered to go if the subject was interesting or if the city she was going to visit had long beckoned to her. But now any trip seemed like martyrdom. Judy still hoped the editor would change his mind and send some. One thing she could not foresee was what awaited her in a few hours. In the state she was in now, Judy hadn't even thought of bringing any food with her. To be honest, she was glad if no one forced her to take a bite in her mouth if there was an opportunity to avoid lunch or dinner. Food seemed fake paper. It was impossible to imagine someone feeling hunger and then satisfying it with pleasure. But Judy had forgotten to buy water too. Her throat was always dry, and what could she drink her pills with? And she went out there to the platforms where the trains stood and where there were kiosks with all sorts of little things that might be needed on the road. Dosharaki, toiletries, and yes, big and small bottles. Boarding for her train was to be announced in about an hour, and Judy walked slowly down the platform. One train was already preparing to pull away. Old gray-red cars, dusty windows. The conductresses were closing the doors. Suddenly Judy's lips opened, and the bottle slipped from her hands. If it had been glass, it would have shattered into 1,000 pieces. But as it was, it just rolled to the edge of the platform and then fell on the rails. In one of the parlor cars, on the lower side shelf, which was now folded into a table and 2 seats, sat Mike and Lillian. They were talking animatedly and cheerfully among themselves about something. It was a waking dream or a hallucination, but so vivid that Judy clutched her head. As if by clenching her temples with the palms of her hands, she could bring her mind back into place. Mike had been buried in a closed casket, but Judy had donated clothes to the morgue, and now her husband was wearing the same light gray jacket and the same shirt that Judy knew she would never see again. And Lillian was wearing a blue knit dress, white basque and appliqued with a big red cherry, and her daughter's hair was braided as carelessly as it usually was in life. Lillian was so lively, so agile that strands were immediately dislodged from the short braids. And when Judy came to pick up her daughter at daycare, Lillian was already disheveled. Her mother couldn't remember who had braided her hair the last time, or if it had been braided at all. "It is supposed to tie a headscarf." Mike told his daughter something, gesticulating, and Lillian laughed. And one of her top teeth was missing. It had just begun to erupt. This is only in the cartoon freaking Bach from the fairy tale about Carlson could cheerfully hume. La 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 la, I've gone crazy. In reality, it's a creepy feeling. Judy was experiencing terror. Obviously, her sanity had left her. Maybe when she turns around, she'll see dragons and dinosaurs walking around instead of a train station or zombies or whatever other crazy things she sees. She turned around like a hunted animal, But everything was so peaceful, so calm, so ordinary. People were waiting for the train to depart, strolling along the platform, hurrying somewhere with their bags. Here came the suburban train. And then Judy looked out the window again. Her husband and daughter were still talking, and now Lillian was explaining something to her father. Judy began to bang her palms on the glass to get them both to turn toward her, but neither of them reacted. Judy tried to scream and couldn't. Her throat went into spasm. At that time, the train moved. The young woman followed it, then ran. But because she didn't look under her feet, she fell after a few steps, shattering her knees, and cried. But not from pain, but from resentment at fate. Someone helped her up. Someone shook her off. "Oh, did you fall behind the train?" She heard the questions, and the train had already disappeared there, around the corner where there were streetlights and rails in plenty. I'm behind, yes," Judy muttered, not realizing at once that she didn't even know where that train had gone. "And your things are there, aren't they? And your papers, I suppose. You can ask. Go to the station and ask there where the next stop of the train will be. You could take a cab and go there. A car would be faster anyway. It'll be expensive, though." Judy forgot about everything, including the fact that she had left her bag at the beginning of the platform. The main thing was that the small purse with her passport and money was still hanging on her shoulder. The station master did not want to understand her. "Mate, tell me the number of your carriage and the place. I'll notify you by telegram. I'll call the place where the next 10-minute stop will be. Your things will be taken out. You'll take them quietly. What's the number of the car?" Judy didn't know whether the train was going to New York or Manchester, and it wasn't the things she wanted, only the direction and where the stop would be. Eventually, with great difficulty, she managed to get that information. Accompanied by a stout, young conductor, Judy walked through the carriage. At first, she had refused to be let in, without a ticket and with a crazy look in her eyes, no telling what she might have done. But Judy was ready to kneel before the conductresses. "Oh, they're here, they're alive," she repeated, and she carried on, mixing everything into one pile, both about her dead loved ones and about the fact that she had just seen them. One conductor was just a girl, about 18 years old, no more. She looked sympathetically at Judy, but dared not make a decision herself, and looked back at her older companion. "All right, let's go," she finally decided. Judy was thin and short, and the conductor apparently decided that if the need arose, she would simply take this frail-looking lady by the scruff of the neck and put her on the platform. They walked along the carriage, and Judy's heart was pounding frantically at the thought that right now she might see her own. Her friend's son had gone out to get bread in the evening and never returned. For a long time after that, Judy dreamed that she would accidentally meet this boy. After all, it can be. Robbers hit him on the head, the boy lost his memory, and wanders in the neighborhood of the city, not remembering who he is and where he should go. But she, Judy, recognizes him, calls a cab, brings him to his mother. She anticipates that she herself will be on the verge of life and death with happiness. Maybe fate had decided to play the same game with her. But they went on, and here was the middle of the carriage. Here was the end of it, and Mike and Lillian were gone. Gone. Didn't you find them? The conductor asked. "Do you even remember where they were sitting?" "Right there, I think." Judy pointed to the spot. Now there was a heavy-set older man sitting there, eating a hard-boiled egg, dipping it in a mound of salt piled on a newspaper. He had nothing to do with Mike. But why did the two conductresses glance over with such a strange expression? Judy looked at them with despair, and the younger one couldn't stand it. That's where that idiot was riding." "Which one?" Judy asked with just her lips. Some girl sat down, a young girl, and it seems that she was either drunk or, more likely, even got into trouble. Said the senior conductor. Well, and caught a glitch. She is generally so beautiful. The younger one picked up. I thought, what kind of a bird? An actress or a singer, maybe from the stage. But such people go in a sleeping carriage. Or at least in a compartment car, or just a whore, Maine corrected the older one. Well, like they used to show in the movies about different intergirls, her dress is pink, and like a stocking in a flap. And the neckline, you don't even have to bend over, you can a leather jacket. And her hair is long, white and dyed. Black eyebrows, black eyes, she's naturally dark, that's for sure. But she dyed it, and now it's all blonde curls down her shoulders. I thought, I guess Melody and the Three Musketeers must be like that. Oh, but why is she an idiot? Judy pleaded. You speak quickly, said the older woman, hurrying her partner. We'll be on the road in a couple of minutes. It's nothing. I'm ready to ride with you in the vestibule, standing up to the next station. I'll pay, only, please, remember, maybe you saw this man with a little girl. Well, we look at the tickets. You, said the senior conductor irritably. There was no one with this surname. And children we have, thank you, God, in the flight only 2. And we disembarked this fool together with the train director. We were standing there for 3 minutes at the previous station. The police didn't even get there in time. Although we should have called an ambulance, she was talking such nonsense. At first she was sitting, looking at one point, and her eyes were so black and burning. Then she started shouting, slapping herself. She was slapping one hand on the other, slapping her sides, slapping her shoulders. Go away from me, please go away. I can't see you anymore. I know you're not here. Leave me alone. And then she began to whine like a dog. I can't anymore. They all go crazy alone. Judy said quietly, as if to herself, quoting a phrase from a cartoon. It's only the flu that everyone gets sick together. Well, it's a good thing she was dropped off and a normal person took her seat. What did you say her name was? Judy asked quickly. Did she get off at the end of the line? And where was she going? The older conductor went to the compartment to look at the her part of the ticket. Her name is Yuji, she said when she came back, Yuji Rachel. She was on her way to NSK, only it so happened that she didn't make it. They dropped her off at look for psychiatric hospitals or narcology clinics, the young woman advised. She obviously needs treatment. That's all we can tell you. Please get off. The train is leaving now. As soon as Judy stepped onto the platform, the younger conductor removed the ladder and closed the door. After another moment, the train jerked faintly, and the cars floated past. Judy ran her palm over her face. She shouldn't have hoped for anything, of course. It was all a delusion, a sick imagination, and the Yugi of the train was just drunk. Good thing she wasn't seeing green devils. Still, immediately a crazy feeling of fatigue came over her. Judy remembered that she was going on a business trip today, that the hotel had already booked a room for her, but for about another hour she just sat on a bench in the station square and didn't have the energy to get. She was supposed to write about a fallen hero, so there was no way to postpone the business trip. The editor chased her off with the expectation that she would get to the funeral and talk to her relatives. It meant sprinkling salt on Judy's own wound, but the editor had a cynical calculation. If he sent one of the young girls or boys, they were called walking tape recorders in the newsroom, to write the story, they could hardly write themselves, but they collected the necessary information. So it is unlikely that any of these dictaphones would have been able to talk to relatives. Not all relatives are willing to take their grief public. Judy was a raw nerve. Her co-workers referred to her as Lady Death. She so listened and so empathized that the loved ones of the deceased understood. She is with them on the same wave. And even in such a situation, a young guy, the only son in the family, worked in the Ministry of Emergency Situations. The mountains in that area are not high, and yet, what carried the two guys to climb the rock? It was clear they were attracted by the sculpture. A few years ago, they put a marble mountain goat here, and how did they drag the heavy statue to the tiny site? But it turned out beautifully. If you take photos from below, the river, the rock, the goat. However, a real pilgrimage began among the locals. Even ants tried to climb up the narrow, steep path. Some wanted to take selfies with the goat. Others tried to break off a piece of horn as a souvenir or sign on the rock, to leave a certificate that Barry was here. And at a bad hour, 2 boys went up there. Going up was much easier than coming down. Luckily, the children were spotted on the rock. Their cries were heard, and the townspeople started calling emergency services. Everyone knew about the goat. The rescuers were well aware how difficult it is to get a person off a small platform. There was not even a strip of shore below. The river was deep and wide, and there was a current from the hydroelectric power plant. And still Igor managed to lower the boys. But he himself, already without insurance, going back, fell off and crashed. The height was not that great, He just fell unluckily. For Judy, there was nothing heavier than such materials. But the editor emphasized that lately she had been submitting few texts and that she could not work like that. Otherwise, she would have to think about being laid off. And she needed a piece of bread, not to sit on her mother-in-law's neck. And now she had to go and then look for this strange Yuji Romanov. Judy took the bus, a 4-hour ride. Before, when she had the energy to think about anything other than her personal drama, she'd wondered, why do you get so tired on the road? You're just sitting there doing nothing, but you are exhausted as if it was you, not the chauffeur who held the steering wheel in your hands. You, not the bus. Over came kilometer after kilometer, turn after turn. And it was impossible to get rid of this feeling, as if you were overpowering this way by yourself. The road was monotonous. One field was replaced by another, and along the highway on both sides grew American maples, a real cursed tree that someone had brought here once, and it had taken over everything around it. And you couldn't take it out. Perhaps the little prince had had an easier time with baobabs on his home planet than he had with these maples here. Judy tried to look at the news on the internet, but when she read on the road, she felt queasy. She covered her eyes, tried to doze off, and then gave up. Her dreams had been so heavy and scary lately, unless she took some pills and fell into a black hole. Finally, when her whole body was stiff, she reached the place. A big village or a small town? It was hard to tell. There was no one to greet Judy. And when the bus, having made a circle, stopped to drop off passengers and pick up new ones, she felt that acute longing again. If she was going home, Mike would find an opportunity to meet her, pick up her bag, and they would walk. And all the way she would ask about her daughter, if she was all right, and how they were doing, but there were other people meeting their loved ones. And Judy had to get to the hotel where she'd booked a room. It was strange that there was a hotel here. It had been a hotel from the beginning, when the town had been a tanning mill, when specialists and business travelers had come here. A 2-story yellow building in the style of Stalin's empire, and 2 sculptures near it remain from that time. A silver-painted worker or an engineer. The man was holding some papers rolled up in a tube, and a monumental woman with shoulder-length curls and a bouquet of flowers in her hands. Then the mill closed down, and the hotel was transformed into a nursing home for a while. Paid, of course, and advertisements were hanging on every corner. If you have elderly relatives, try to give them here. But it was expensive to keep old people here, and the idea quickly failed. Then the hotel was reopened here, but it was popular only in the warm season. There were enough tourists who wanted to swim in the river and climb the surrounding mountains. The rooms were the same, no standards or suites. Judy was given a key to a room on the 2nd floor. As she climbed the stairs, she thought that she must be the only guest here now. It was so quiet. The room seemed empty and shabby. There were 2 beds, 2 nightstands, 1 chair, a sink, and a mirror. The windows looked out onto a quiet green boulevard, and according to the receptionist, it was literally 2 steps to the beach. But today Judy didn't feel up to making them. She needed to get something to eat. But then again, that would be dragging herself into town, looking for stores or cafes. Judy always carried a half-liter jar and a small boiling pot with her on business trips. Now she poured water into the jar, and when it boiled, she threw a bouillon cube into it. And then she sat and sipped the salty, chemically broth, and it was enough for her. The time was early evening, neither to the country nor to the city. It was too early to go to bed and too late to run errands. Judy decided to do all the chores for tomorrow, and then she could leave in the evening. The bus wouldn't run anymore. She would take a cab to the train station. Expensive, but she wanted to go home. To her hole like a sick animal. Her things were still in the bag she left on the platform. Judy lay down, pulled the blanket over her. Everything was foreign here, other people's bedding, other people's smells. She had previously considered the hardest time in her life to be when her mother decided to arrange her own personal life. She honestly waited until Judy graduated from high school and entered the institute. She left everything behind and moved to the north. Not every woman dares to take such a step when she's in her 40s. Judy didn't even know her father. All her mother told her about him was that he was married, and she didn't expect him to leave his family for her. "So you are a true love child," Mom said, "and you are bound to be beautiful and happy." Never once did her father help with a penny. Never once wrote or called. Sometimes Judy thought her mother had lied to her, and it was all an accident. In some drunken company. Anyway, her mom raised her and taught her, and then she got recruited to work a shift. Here she was a cook in a restaurant, preparing fine dishes, and there she was to become a cook on some bush, porridge, stew, and other canned goods. Even my mother's friends resented her. How she left her daughter and went to some darkness. She'll come back, they told Judy. You'll see, she'll come back. But Mama didn't come back. She liked everything about the North, and the money, which you can't make here, and the cold beauty of nature when the sky, the earth, and the water are cast in metal, and the fact that you can take your own life like clay and mold it into what you want. Mama got married very quickly. She asked Judy to come to the wedding, but she didn't come. She felt people, and she knew that Mama had invited her not in a special way, as her only daughter, but on a par with other old acquaintances. Judy was a scrap to Mama now, and Mama was the same to Judy. Mama sent Judy a present, a deerstalker hat, tough fur. Judy stroked it, and she felt sorry for the deer that had been killed. Some people, after a lifetime of pain, become hardened, unfeeling. And some people's souls, on the contrary, becomes thin. Judy couldn't even look at a squashed worm. It was painful, heartbreaking. They never saw each other again. Several times a year, her mother sent short letters that fit on a single notebook page. They sold some northern shares, bought an apartment. Going on vacation to the sea, there was a life there, and lately Judy didn't even want to open the envelope. Not once did she feel between the lines that her mother was worried about her, missed her, wanted to see her. The people who were closest to her, they had become strange. Her mom left the apartment to Judy, and while the girl studied at the institute, her friends envied her. Live as you want. Do what you want. No one's ordering you. But when Judy returned from the library in the dark winter evening, she had to work a lot in the reading room. She leaned against the icy window and stared longingly at the windows of high-rise buildings. There were lights on almost everywhere. There, behind those curtains, green, blue, yellow, red, people fried potatoes, quarreled and reconciled, talked about what had happened during the day and loved each other. The windows of her apartment were invariably dark. Judy walked in and breathed in the stale air. At that time, she felt infinitely lonely, and no one needed her but herself. And then it was May, and the first heavy rain. It smelled of lilacs, and the rain fell with such force that it seemed to mix the earth and the sky. She had a huge umbrella. Judy couldn't remember how or why she'd bought it, a big man's umbrella in dark gray plaid. You couldn't fold it up and put it in your purse, but you could walk with it like a cane. The umbrella covered the sky. Suddenly, a tall, handsome guy ducked under it. Judy would have said, "Young man, this isn't a fairy tale fungus. You can't fit everyone in here. But how do you kick a man out into the rain?" And the guy intercepted the handle and raised the zones higher, began to hold it over her and over himself. Then they rode in one trolleybus, and there was so much water around that there were storms behind the trolleybus. It was like he was a steamboat. And then suddenly, all of a sudden, the rain stopped, but Mike went to see her off anyway. Later, he confessed that he just wanted to know where she lived, so she had everything at once. Mike gave her not only himself, but also his family, who accepted Judy as their own. It was funny, but Judy was afraid to leave the maternity ward. The nurses were so skillful with babies. She didn't even know how to swaddle Lillian yet. She was afraid to take her in her arms, for she was not yet able to hold her head up, and she leaned back helplessly. But not her own mother, but her mother-in-law, Angie, came to her aid, and for the first few weeks she simply moved in with the young people. Judy was still a child herself, exhausted as hell during the day. At night, she could not immediately find the strength to open her eyelids, to get up, to lull her crying daughter to sleep. And how many times had Angie done it for her? Maybe the other daughter-in-law didn't appreciate it. But Judy, orphaned with a living mother, was grateful to the point of tears. "You know," she said to Mike, "when your parents are old, I want to take care of them. For a long, long time. There's nothing else I can really do to thank them." The night in the strange place passed just as it had at home. Judy woke up at the dumbest hour and went to take her pills. In the morning, she took the same jar of soup from the day before, made stronger tea, thought about how she couldn't bring herself to swallow anything again. and drove to the beach. There, at the lifeguard station, worked guys who saw everything with their own. There was an unexpectedly beautiful promenade, not at all for a small town, with a carved lattice and the traditional tree of happiness. On a stylized metal tree, newlyweds hung ribbons and locks. As a sign of eternal love, Judy averted her eyes. The beach was small, not very well cared for, with grass poking up through the sand. To the left was the rock with the white goat on it. From here it seemed impossible to reach it at all. On the right, on a natural hillside, there was a bench with 2 lifeguards sitting on it, both in identical blue t-shirts, wearing caps with long visors. With 1 binoculars for 2, which they passed to each other, keeping an eye on the bothers. 2 from the same box, identical from the face, Judy thought. She went over to them, introduced herself. Up close, they looked alike too. Probably not even 30 yet. Sturdy, tanned, about the same height. Years in journalism had taught Judy how to sense people. Even before the guys started answering her questions, she realized that they were unlikely to tell her anything interesting. Well, he did what he had to do. One of the boys obviously didn't know what else to say about his dead comrade. We have a rule about not feeling sorry for ourselves, thinking of others first. I'd rather those fools had crashed and he had lived. His partner suddenly objected. The only son, his mother loved him so much, his sister, and those boys who drove them there. They went in on their own, and their families with many children. If something had happened to them, there'd still be someone left. That's why he's saying that the parents of those boys were told to come to the funeral and bring flowers. The guy died saving your kids. So what do you think? No one from that side will come. They said they had no money for wreaths, so they should leave them alone. And today again, young people were climbing to the goat. The second rescuer spit aside. Honestly, I will not shoot such idiots. I will turn aside and pretend that I did not see anything. They are on their own, of their own free will. Another thing is on the water. We've got currents here because of the hydroelectric power station. You can miscalculate. Yesterday, a little girl of 2 years old was almost swept away, and her mom was on the shore drinking beer and looking at her phone. I barely had time to grab the child. Oh, did you know him well? Judy asked, referring to the dead EMT. Oh, not much when he was alive. She caught the second rescuer's gaze and was surprised. His face was young, but his eyes were so tired, so old. We crossed paths, of course, but not so much that. But now I dream about him. Judy nodded. It was familiar. She hailed a cab and drove to the other end of town, to where the dead man's mother and sister lived. It was a small pink house surrounded by red brick mansions. A family of old-timers, and next to them, those who had bought land here and built up. They have swimming pools and jacuzzis, and here, a column in front of a dilapidated neighbors can't wait for the last Mohicans to sell them their house, or rather the land on which it stands. In the yard sat a skinny girl in jeans and a faded t-shirt. She was smoking. The dead man's sister, Violet, Judy guessed. What is there to say hello? I'm a journalist. Can you tell me how you're feeling right now? Readers flock to other people's pain like flies to honey. Judy pushed open the unlocked gate and entered. May I sit with you? She asked and was down on the old bench before Violet nodded. Well, that's tradition too. Doors don't close on funeral days. Judy remembered those days. The worst days of her life, and cried. Now it was just the two of them, and Violet handed Judy an open package of tissues. Oh, are you from his work? Violet asked. Judy shook her head. Mommy doesn't believe it, said Violet. She gets sleep shots all the time. She wakes up and comes out of her room and says to me, "It's not true, is it?" What can I say? I'm not a priest to promise the kingdom of God. A priest, Judy thought. Yeah, I should go to church. Who else can explain last night's obsession to me? She and Violet sat like that for a long time. One smoked, the other stared straight ahead, as if in a trance. It was a quiet interval, and no one came in. There would be no more such silence until the guests left after the wake. The dead lifeguard's mother came out. Small stature, dense, black-haired woman, crumpled robe, disheveled hair. She took a cigarette from her daughter's pack and sat down to smoke next to her. Judy realized she'd just woken up. Her medication was wearing off. Her mother said to Violet confidentially, as if to tell her something she had never heard before, "And our Sam is gone." Judy would have to seize the moment and ask her mother about her son, ask the dozens of questions necessary to write an essay. "You don't understand," the editor admonished. "That's the kind of condition that makes people talkative." But a cramp tightened Judy's throat, and she couldn't ask. Everyone experiences grief differently. Her friend, having lost her mother, hung pictures of the deceased all over the walls. Judy herself couldn't look at the pictures of Mike and Lillian for the first time. There was a tragic incongruity in the fact that there they were in the photos, so alive, laughing, and that would never, ever happen again. "I'm gonna go," she said to Violet, standing up. "I'll ask my neighbor to take you to the hotel," she said, rising. "What do you want to do now?" "Sit down." Judy tried to hold her back, but Violet insisted. "You don't know the town you'll be wandering about. Come back tomorrow at 11. Maybe your mother will talk to you afterwards, if she has the strength." Violet left Judy at the gate and went to the next house to make arrangements. Then she waved her hand. "Come here, Edgar will take you." Judy didn't know much about car brands, but she realized she was looking at a real rarity. Red, rich colors, but the shape. It must have been the kind of car she'd seen on the streets when her grandmother was young. "Begin." "Don't be afraid," said the young man behind the wheel. "I'll drive you like a queen. Their Majesties are in no hurry." She pulled the handle, and the door opened with unexciting ease. "What make is this?" Victory," Edgar said. "It's still Grandpa's car, so she was right about Grandma." "No. Don't worry, we'll get there really well," Yue said, while the Victory was getting out of the private sector. "I'm not a kamikaze. It was in the garage for a long time. Our city is small. Everything here is more on foot. The car was just a memory of my grandfather. They told me once in the Caucasus, when a Dzigit dies, no one rides his horse anymore. He is released into the herd. And then they started to persuade me to sell it. We have a run of retro cars here every year for the 9th of May, and there's almost nothing to show, only 2 or 2 vintage cars. I first tried to see if it would start, imagine, with half a turn. My grandfather loved it very much, took care of it all his life. So I thought, I'd better take part in the race, and then she'll go back, I almost said, to the stall, back to the garage. Edgar was maybe even good looking, if he didn't talk so much. Judy's thoughts were now far away from here. Tomorrow afternoon, when this was over, she could leave. Hardly any time to talk to her mother. The poor woman was hanging on by her thumbs as it was. But Sam had a fiancé. Friends were coming. Judy felt exhausted, and she wished it were over. Suddenly, she realized that Edgar was addressing her. "Oh, I beg your pardon," she interjected. "I'm saying let's stop at a cafe," he repeated. "You're in a strange city. You must be hungry. Violet hasn't offered you anything. She doesn't care. Don't worry, I'm not inviting you to a fancy restaurant. There's an outdoor cafe 2 minutes from the park. At least you can have a coffee." Judy thought for a few seconds and nodded. It was an unpretentious young people's cafe where you couldn't count on a lot of pickles. It was called On the Fire, and in the fall, couples probably sat inside in the small room, watching old Tom and Jerry cartoons while it was dark outside the window and jets of freezing rain mixed with snow ran down the windows. Judy and her companion were now settled on the open veranda. A stone's throw away was the road, and beyond it, the old movie theater. The poplars above them were old, too. They must have been at least half a century old. Judy imagined what she could eat now. Her body had long ago gone into overdrive, losing its sense of self-preservation. The less and less often she ate, the less hungry she felt. She reminded herself of the horse the gypsy had almost trained to go without food. But the ungrateful mare had finally died. "Oh, ice cream," Judy said to the waitress. "Chocolate ice cream and something to drink." "Oh, a drink?" the girl asked. No, juice, morsels, lemonade." "Well, whatever you have, a large glass." Edgar nodded, indicating he wanted the same. Somehow the cranberry morsels, sour and cold, made Judy feel as if she were really drunk. She and Edgar talked about the family she was to write about. "It's a good thing Yugi's gone," he said. "Otherwise the family would have gone crazy." "Oh, why?" Judy asked in a low voice. "Oh, there was this girl who lived here. There's a big difference in years between us. I was a senior, and she was a freshman. She was the one I carried on my shoulder, ringing the bell. She was pretty, like a doll. Funny, she had a good voice. She sang at school and town festivals. She started going out early. She was about 15, and her mom was going around in the evenings. Do you have Yugi? You don't have Eugene? And then she said she was afraid for her daughter because she seemed to have lost her mind. She started talking to people who weren't around. What's that like? Judy asked cautiously. At first, they thought she just had too much to drink. Well, you know, she was always being called out. She's very cheerful. And at that age, you boast when there's a lot of booze on the table. Oh, like how much I drank last night. And a drunk person can dream up all sorts of things, up to the proverbial squirrel or green dough. And her mother had already told her, Apogee, you're still very young. Let's go for treatment. They'll give you a drug treatment. Otherwise, in a couple of years, you'll be out of your mind. Then it became clear that the matter was more serious. Her mother went on vacation, spent the whole month with Yugi, holding her hand, figuratively speaking, to keep her from doing anything. And the girl started to talk at all. No one's around, but she's talking to someone. Her mother decided there was nothing to do. She had to go to a hospital. There, they'll choose medication, and the daughter will be normal. Her mother cried a lot. She had no one but Yugi. She dreamed that she would get married, have grandchildren, go on and on. But now what marriage? What grandchildren? What if all this will be passed on to the children? Well, there's nothing to do. People live with other diseases. We'd already agreed on a hospital, but at the last moment, Yugi just ran away. What's her last name? Judy asked quickly. Edgar raised his eyebrows, surprised that his new acquaintance was so interested in the story. Oh, last name, Reichel. But you couldn't possibly know it. Things were beginning to make sense. There was a crazy woman named Yugi Reichel in the train with the conductors, and she'd been dropped off halfway through because she was acting more than a little strange. She could have told Edgar about it, put him on the trail, but for some reason Judy didn't. Maybe she sympathized with the strange girl who was fleeing the mental institution as best she could, and whose voices had she heard? Judy asked. Edgar shrugged his shoulders. I think it was more complicated than that here. It wasn't like Napoleon or Cleopatra talking to her. She'd never heard voices like that before. It's like a radio. You know, you spin the wheel and it picks up different frequencies. Yugi heard the voices of people far away from her, but real, living voices. And sometimes the voices of the dead. Judy shuddered, but tried to pull herself together. No one could check that. She was probably schizophrenic or something like that. But Edgar stood his ground. She was kind of a transmitter. I'll tell you a case. It is not on the rumor except for me. It is unlikely that anyone will tell you. There was a lonely grandmother, a nice, intelligent one. She was friendly with an old man. Then she died. And then, before the wake was over, her relatives showed up, the seventh water on the vine. They said that she had no one close to her except us, so the apartment and the summer house were all ours. We're selling it immediately. We need the money to pay off our daughter's mortgage. I didn't even know her, the grandmother. But then I passed by her house and saw Yugi sitting on the porch, shaking her head. Only her blonde curls were visible, and the fingers she was running through them. I couldn't stand it, so I came over and asked, are you sick? She lifts her head, her eyes red as a rabbit's. And she says, a will. What will, your mother? Are you going to die? The old woman left a will. God, why does she come to me and not to her grandfather? She left everything to him. She'd come to him from the other side of the world and tell him the good news. Will she make him happy? I asked. Will she make him happy? He's already 90 years old. What does he need? It's a small thing, but it's nice, said Yugi. The main thing is that those insolent women won't get anything. And I don't know how it all came out, but the aunts had to leave without bread. It turned out that the grandmother really made a will in favor of the only person who came to her until the end of days and took care of her. Well, that doesn't prove anything. Judy tried to object. A copy of the will is kept at the notary's, and that old man must have known that. I'm telling you, nobody knew anything. Judy waved her hand. To think that she'd wanted to cling to this thread, and it turned out to be just about a mentally ill girl. She hadn't thought about it recently, but now, ex post facto, she wished Lillian had some bright talent, that she would sing or paint or poetry. Then people would remember her for a long, long time. She would be like a candle that burns in eternity. And so people will come to the cemetery to their relatives and passing by the double monument, except that they will notice the child's face. They will say, "How little she lived, pity the little girl," and they'll forget it in a few moments. And when she's gone, Judy, there'll be no one left to remember Lillian. "Oh, now let me take you to the hotel," Edgar said. Why did he seem intrusive to her at first? He drove his fossilized car in silence, and the trip didn't take 5 minutes. When the Victory stopped in front of the hotel, Edgar got out first, opened the door, and then saw that Judy's eyes were full of tears. He sat down beside her and put his arm around her. She had never let anyone touch her before, those gestures of pity, of sympathy. But now she snuggled into Edgar's shoulder and burst into tears. He stroked her head, and she breathed in that lively odor cologne, cigarette sweat, the warmth of his hands, and she felt better. "Thank you," she said, finally pulling away. "I'm sorry you had to. Would you like me to pick you up tomorrow?" He asked. Violet said, "I thought I had something else to do, but it turns out," she said. She waved her hands and walked, without looking back toward the hotel porch. When she reached her second floor, she saw someone sitting near her door. There were no lights on here during the day, and the hallway was in semi-darkness. It took Judy to get very close for her to see a blonde young girl in a thin, stocking-like dress and leather jacket, sitting on the floor. "Finally," she said angrily, as if they'd arranged to meet, and Judy was late, later than they'd agreed. "I've got my own life, and I'm supposed to be doing yours." Judy couldn't believe her eyes. It was the same Yuji in front of her. How did she know her, this almost girl? She looked like a singer from some cafe chanteuse. Very brightly painted eyes, probably a kilogram of mascara on each one, no less. Her hair had been lightened at some barbershop, not at home. It was very light, almost white, and every hair seemed to glow, to play with color. When Judy was a child, she had a doll with such a chevrolet. When Judy stood up, she was short, slender, graceful, a doll indeed. And yet, how did she know her? Judy wanted to ask her questions, but she reminded herself for the 100th time to hold back, to be careful. There are a lot of crooks out there, especially those who like to play on other people's grief. A man with a wounded soul is especially defenseless. "What do you want?" Judy asked as she unlocked the door to her room. "Oh, you're gonna help me?" Judy's voice again sounded as if everything had been arranged between them. "Oh, why should I help you?" Judy had the choice of either poking the girl to get her to stop poking her or switching to you herself. She couldn't do the latter. Judy was so much younger than her. "So why should I help you?" Judy sat down on the edge of the bed and pointed to the only chair. "Maurice, it's cold in here too. Let's at least put some tea on, not even a kettle. What if I'm hungry too?" "Yeah, and a drink. And there's no place to sleep either. Tell me first why you thought I'd help you at all." They stared at each other as if they were trying to see who would look away first. Neither of them wanted to be foolish and give in. Neither of them was going to be the first to almost meet the other. Both of them were not known for their cunning and ability to turn the situation in their favor. "I'll tell you who sent me and how I found you. Just give me something, please. I don't have a dime. I came back to this town because of you, and now I'm hiding. I can't go home." Judy rose with a sigh and forced herself to do the housework. She always felt exhausted by evening. But lately, no one had stopped her from going to bed early, sometimes even at sunset. She knew that she would quickly shake off the first fatigue and would then suffer from insomnia, but she couldn't help it. She could hardly move, as if in a dream. She boiled water in her invariable half-liter jar. She made some hot mug soup, took out a packet of dry bread. That's what they were for. And she thought she would bring this meager supply back home as usual. Yuji devoured this meager. As the editorial staff would say, homeless food with the greed of a street. She glanced once more at Judy and did not ask if she had any brandy to add to her coffee. She could get by somehow, though it was better not to tell such stories sober. In the beginning, there was the closet, or where to start. With Mom getting a night job, what's night duty when your kid just started school? But Mom got a job as a security guard, and even though she was sorry to leave Yugi behind, Mom played it cool. "Oh, there are neighbors on all sides," she said. "If you need anything, knock on their door. Yeah, with neighbors like that, you don't need robbers or maniacs. They'd be just like anyone else." Mom and Yugi lived in a former dormitory. Once they'd been allowed to privatize the rooms, and the poorest people in town seemed to have gotten their own place. But since that time, no one has been monitoring the condition of the dormitory, and it began to deteriorate surprisingly quickly. No one would have thought of making horror movies in their small town, but it's a pity, and the dorm would be the best place for it. Tattered walls in the corridor, a toilet with broken glass, and a sheet of plywood, a single stove in the common kitchen. The rooms were all small and small. If there was a bed by the window, you could open and close the front door while lying on the bed. You just had to stretch, and the audibility was like a mother. The walls were like paper. Every morning the neighbor was beating his wife, aunts were arguing to find out who stole the chicken from the pot. Children of all ages were shouting in the far room the cat wanted to get married. Perhaps the best way out on those nights, when Mom went on duty, was to close at least a flimsy latch and sit quiet as a mouse. It was especially scary when they started knocking on the door. Who knows why, and then Mom bought a closet. It was old. She'd taken it off someone's hands, tempted by its cheapness. Real wood, dried up over the years, the kind of cupboards they used to make in the 50s. The cabinet had been put in a corner, but it still took up half the room. And as Yuji found out almost immediately, the door didn't close all the way. It was always left open about the size of a child's palm, and that was especially scary at night. When the girl forced herself to turn out the light, her eyes would get used to the darkness after a few minutes, and she could see the outlines of objects, even figure out what was where. But there, in the closet, reigned impenetrable darkness. The second part of the closet, the one with the linen shelves, was narrow. And this one, where Yuji could climb all the way in, this part didn't have a handle on the door. Her mother would never have bothered to buy one to screw it on, and no matter how many times Yuji tried to close the door with a four-folded piece of paper, it creaked open again. There was no use complaining to her mom. Of course, the mockery would follow. Such a big girl, but she's afraid of the closet. Yuji tried to fight her fears. During the day, when it was light, she climbed in and sat inside for long periods of time, convincing herself that lo and behold, everything around her was so ordinary, hanging in smells of dust and old fur Mom's fake fur coat next to a few hangers with so familiar dresses, but someone lived in the closet at night. Yuji knew that for sure. She hadn't read about Narnia, not when she was a child, not when she was older. She'd never liked books. But if a miracle happened and someone talked to her about it, she would dare to tell them, this closet doesn't have a back door that opens into a magical land. No, the darkness weaves a kind of figure in there that becomes more and more real with each passing moment. Yuji had nowhere to go. She was getting used to whoever had taken up residence in her room, and the more she got used to him, the more he revealed himself to her. She could already recognize the glint in his eyes. The long, thin, bony fingers, the nose with a bump. Yuji hesitated to speak to this frightening visitor. In fact, when she saw him, she wasn't sure she could make a sound. Her voice was definitely being taken away. Her nerves were on edge, and at times like this, her vision became especially vivid, and her hearing caught sounds it couldn't distinguish before. When Yuji went to school, she felt better. Her mother, without hesitation, put her in the after-school group. From morning to evening, there were peers around, and she had to work hard to understand what the teacher wanted and not get a failing grade. When her mother saw bad grades in her notebook, at best she would yell at her daughter, and at worst, she would slap her with whatever was at hand. A doubled-up clothesline or a belt with a heavy buckle that would leave bruises for a long time. Yuji's abilities were very average, and she had no attention span at all. She was jumping around at the top of her game, unable to concentrate on anything, and she was happy to get a C. In time, her mother accepted the C's and did not demand. Yuji became so accustomed to studying that she didn't feel exhausted at night. And then the sleepless nights returned. No, if her mother was home, it was okay. Yuji would fall asleep between her and the wall, and she knew it was the safest place in the world. No one could get her. But when Mom was on duty, she also started seeing this strange man during the day, sometimes even several times a day. She saw him here and there. There he was at the newsstand buying a newspaper. The familiar hunchbacked profile, black wavy hair. Yuji approaches, clenching her teeth. She has to face her fears and suddenly sees that this is a completely different man, not from her nightmares. And here she is at the mall and sees a man in a black coat on the escalator, on the embankment, on the bus. Yuji was now lingering wherever she could. She pretended to accidentally stay over at her friend's house and stayed overnight. She asked to go to the only relative who lived with them in the same town, some third cousin's grandmother, who was not at all delighted with her presence but did not kick Yuji out at night. Then it turned out that the girl has a good ear and a nice voice. She was called to several circles at once, but Yuji enrolled in the one where the teacher was kinder and took over her patronage. After classes, she often called her to have dinner, fed Yuji together with her children, and when the girl said that her mother was on duty today, laid her on the couch, it ended badly. Yugi's mother was called to the school and asked to change her job. "You have no right to leave a minor child alone." The head teacher told her, "If you leave everything as it is, we will bother to put Yuji in a boarding school." The mother came home, sat down, and cried, bitterly, like a child, or maybe she felt like a child in those moments, who had been carrying a heavy cart for a long time, but then the strength ran out. It was all gone, completely. Yuji tried to hug her mother, but she pushed her away and screamed, "No, go to your boarding school. You asked for it. You're not happy at home. You're always fed. You can do what you want. And there the educators will show you a happy life, and I'll do whatever I want. I'll get married and fuck you." Far away and for a long time, the mother screamed so much that the neighbors came over. They scolded Yuji. They said that thanks to your mother, you are the only thing keeping you alive. Then they took her away for a long time, and she came in the middle of the night smelling like Uncle Seriosha smelled every day. Yuji didn't know it was the smell of vodka, but she didn't care about that. Because on this night, the one she had always feared spoke to her for the first time. He sat down on the edge of the bed, weightless, and said, did she hear it? Or was it his voice in her head? "You'll be out of here soon." It would seem that one could put a condition on the mother, either the closet or me. But Yuji somehow knew that this creature that had come to them was not going anywhere. It had chosen their home, and it had chosen her. So there was only one way to make its presence less felt. There in the house, it was becoming more and more apparent, crackling and sparking like electrical wires. I should have spent fewer nights at home. And since she was 15, Yuji had been staying with anyone who called her. It could be girlfriends, whether they were close friends or just casual acquaintances, or youth groups, or some guy whose parents had moved away. It didn't matter to Yuji who was around as long as there were other walls. Her mother looked at her like she was lost. It's a small town. So many people already know you here. Close, her mother shook her off squeamishly. Finish school and leave. But it was sooner than that. Yuji took a job at a cafe. Live music, musicians play, she sings. The cafe was more than enough for her talent. For the first time, she had money of her own. She thought it was a lot of money. Not only did the owner pay her, but the guest shoved papers into her hand, and some into her bra. Yuji had to work her ass off to keep from being chased out of here. She dreamed of renting her own corner and inviting someone to live with her. Looks like her fear of being alone will be with her forever. She was the last of those with whom Yuji had made friends, and the girls sometimes had a 10-minute night feast after the cafe closed at midnight, eating a cake or a large pear and a shot of cock. Yuji was noticed here, though, and she rarely left the cafe alone. That evening, she was attracted to a man about 20 years older than she was, but he was kind in his eyes. He paid the musicians, paid them well, and asked him to give Yuji the rest of the evening off. And then they sat in a separate office, and there was no nonsense, except that Uncle had fed Yuji dinner, and she was drunk, without asking his permission. She sat on the arm of the chair, rubbing her new friend's thinning hair. It was like fluff, and it made Yuji laugh. The uncle was playing cards, and losing all the time. His partner, younger and prettier, in Eugene's opinion, had made more money in an hour than Eugene would have made in a year. Luke, the new friend's name, didn't look upset, but his hands were trembling. Yuji wanted to comfort him, or at least tell him to stop playing, but her jaw dropped. Behind her opponent Luke's back, she saw her black man. Their gazes met, and Yuji, no expert in poetry or prose, thought his eyes were like those reflective stripes on road workers' jackets. A steely glow, and Black made a dismissive gesture, touched his card partner's head, and it was as if he'd thrown something away, There was no other way to interpret it. Perhaps if Yugi hadn't been so drunk, she wouldn't have said anything, but she was pretty drunk and she didn't really care. "Oh, why do you need so much money?" she asked. "You're about to die anyway." The black man was no longer in the room, but both men froze. "Oh, what is she saying?" Luke asked his adversary. "Don't pay attention. The girl's champagne is already in her eyes." Luke tried to joke. But I guess that's enough for today." Yugi went to her new friend's house for the night. At dawn, Luke got a phone call. He had just started to answer, and then he squeezed Yugi's shoulder tightly. "Your job? How did you know?" Yugi looked up at him with frightened eyes. That time she'd gotten away with it, with tears and snot. Hysterical, Yugi had sincerely assured him that she didn't know and couldn't know anything, that she'd been a drunken wreck, saying whatever she could. She just felt bad for Luke, that this sneaky guy had beaten him. "Oh, okay, once every 100 years, a gun goes off," Luke said, and stopped the interrogation. Yugi still had a chance to forget everything, to pretend that she was like everyone else's, especially since she was so terribly frightened. But Black began to appear to her more and more often. She didn't have the strength to pretend she didn't notice him. Much later, though Yugi was far from poetry, it occurred to her that Black was a kind of angel of death. If she saw him standing over a man's shoulder, then his days were numbered. Whether he would go to the other world tomorrow or in a few days, it didn't, but Yugi couldn't get used to it. Her heart sank into her heels every time she saw a familiar figure. Then she began to mutter, and sometimes to wave her hands, "Go away, go away." And those who talked to her began to look at her and twist their fingers at her temple. "Gender, the girl with a bad temper, you need to drink less." It got even worse from there. Yugi herself thought bitterly. She's trained herself. She began to see people who needed to be told something. People who longed for the opportunity but didn't have it. It didn't matter whether they were alive or gone. As a rule, the living were far away and contact with them was lost. So she remembered a little girl who longed for her father. The mother decided to divorce and took the child away. The little girl's feelings were very strong because Yugi had seen her for a long time. She only said, "I can't help you," she said. Then the story of the will, when her grandmother, who had just passed away, tried to get through to her. Everything ended well without Eugenie's intervention. At the right moment, the will came to light. All the property went to the unmarried husband of the old woman, not her relatives with raking hands. And as the case went on, the more people Yugi saw. "Oh, I am not a telegraph or a transmitter." She tried to retort, "Leave me alone." But in vain she cried, waved her hands, and tried to explain something to those who no one but she could see. It made no impression on the people she was talking to, and sometimes it was easier to do what they asked than to get the ghosts to let go. Yugi dialed a number, saying a few phrases in an irritated tone. There was stunned silence on the other end. She hung up and asked the void, "Is that?" And if the answer was silence, she sighed with relief. She'd never heard of psychics, and she wasn't about to learn anything about her abilities, which she'd discovered so suddenly. Yugi rather considered them a curse and dreamed of getting rid of them. But her behavior scared her own mother to death. She first watched her daughter with her mouth ajar as she had another conversation. And then she questioned, "Do you drink or do you do drugs? Breathe, show me your hands." Not hearing Yugi's assurances that she hadn't taken a drop since the whistleblowing started, her mother dragged her to the psychoneurological dispensary. In their town, it was believed that normal people went there only to get a medical examination, and all the others who come there are either unfortunate or relatives of unfortunate people, alcoholics, drug addicts, and their relatives. It was kind of shameful for the rest of us to go there, so the mother went alone, and apparently she told a lot of stories about Yugi that convinced her that the girl should be put in the hospital. There was no other way out. But since Yugi had not been diagnosed yet, and she was not a threat to society yet, that is, she was not running around naked and with a knife in her hands, she could not be taken away by force. She had to come voluntarily. "Oh, if you come with me, you'll go to the asylum." Her mother was not going to tolerate objections. This time, Yugi didn't see Black behind her mother's back. He just shook his head, then pointed outside the window. There lay the railroad bed, and in the evening, Yugi received a phone call from an unknown man whose voice was both ingratiating and creepy. "Are you home, sweetie?" he asked. And although Yugi usually spoke first and thought later, this time she was scared. What did you want? She couldn't think of a better answer. We have a man missing, she heard, and she felt goosebumps run through her body. An important man. And we have this assumption that he's dead. And you, they say, you have a channel directly with the cosmos is established. Not like other P. Further, there was a florid swearing clairvoyance. So you're going to tell us everything, whether our friend is alive or not, and if not, who did it and where he was buried or drowned. Deal, sweetie. For me, I can't. Yuji didn't say it, she just mumbled it. You can, her voice assured her affectionately. Everyone talks to us well. And we don't offend them then. We'll even thank you, sweetie. Wait, we're on our way up. Yugi threw the phone away. Shaking hands, shoved her passport and all the money she had in the house and let her mother say she stole it into her purse, which was more like a cosmetic bag on a chain. She threw on a leather jacket that was hanging on the rack and unfortunately, she didn't have any other shoes. Slipped her feet into high-heeled loafers. Perhaps her second talent, besides hearing voices, was the ability to run in those high heels without locking the door, which was strictly forbidden in the dormitory. Even the wet laundry that was drying on the radiator was stolen. Yugi flew down the hall and ran down the small, narrow staircase that no one ever used. It was kind of like a back door, and the tenants had been dumping junk down there, and it was still a long way down. Yugi opened the door a finger first and saw that there was a black Jeep at the entrance to the dormitory. It wasn't that no one here had such cars. No one here even knew anyone with such cars. Fortunately, it had long since gotten dark. The girl slipped out of the entrance, ducked down, ran a few steps, hiding behind the bushes of lilacs, and when it was impossible to see her from the car, she went with quick and easy steps. Rather to the railway station. A couple of times on the way she was mistaken for a girl of easy virtue and offered a job in her specialty. But Yugi shuddered so much, looked so terrified, that she was left behind. An hour later, she boarded a train, the first one to stop at the platform. Judy rubbed her forehead, tired. Please, I don't collect unusual stories. One thing I want to know is why me? Why me? I was trying to make a mess of things, said Judy, but I happened to be driven to you. By who? Well, I guess your voices whispered to you, and you decided to come back here, but you didn't go home because they're looking for you and threatening you. Isn't that right? He's almost. I'll stay at your place tonight, okay? But I'm only here till morning. I'll finish my article tomorrow and then I'll come home. They said you'd help me. Yugi looked at her with black eyes that burned. Who? Yours. Husband and daughter. The daughter didn't say anything most of the time, though. That's your mic talking. Look, Judy pleaded. I can understand. My tragedy has been written about a lot. It may have been a long time ago, but you read it somewhere. You're a psychic, a medium. I don't know what to call you. I'm ready to believe anything right now. But I beg you, honestly, tell me that you made it all up because you want something from me. I'd rather help you for nothing than have you torture me. Or, Judy suddenly had a thought, so much so that she put her hand to her cheek. Or, were you a friend of Mike's? You're young, you're pretty. Maybe he kept it from me. They want you to know that they're doing fine, Yuji said angrily, and you have too many important things to do to be walking around like a zombie, body. But that's the kind of thing anyone can come up with. Walk up to any suffering relative and say your deceased are doing fine. Don't worry. Judy turned away to the window and her shoulders shook. The blue dragon, Yugi said in the same angry tone, the blue dragon in the apron. You put it next to your daughter because it was her favorite toy, and you covered it with a blanket so that no grandmother at the funeral would say that it wasn't supposed to be there. How did you know that? Judy's eyes widened. It's nobody? Tell me again. I'm still hoping for a miracle. Maybe they're not. For the last time, Yugi was mouthing the words. Let them go. You'll see for yourself later that they're doing fine. You will if you do it right. But you have to help me. Oh, how? Judy shouted it in a whisper, but she shouted it. Hey, I don't know, Yuji said, as they began to settle in for the night. The girl asked, let's move the beds. Do you want to sleep against the wall like when you were a kid? Don't laugh, I'm not used to it. The further I get, the more scared I get. Yugi even shuddered, and he likes to come at night the most. I don't care who's around as long as it's a living soul. The last few days must have worn her out. because she fell asleep before she had a chance to get comfortable in bed. Judy woke up at the dead of night as usual. She sighed, thinking that she would have to lie like this for some time, talking herself to sleep a little longer and pushing away the thoughts that kept crowding in and out of her head. She ran her gaze around the nearly empty hotel room. A streetlight was burning across the street, so Judy could see clearly the streaks in the wallpaper and the things thrown on the chair and the coat rack in the corner, near which the darkness had thickened and seemed to take on the image of a man. It couldn't be. It was just imagination playing out. When Judy was a child, when she fell asleep, she used to look at the pattern on the rug, distinguishing funny animals in the zigzags and curls of colored wool. And once on the picture, where a bouquet of flowers was depicted, she saw a whole scene. It was not a pink flower, but the face of a girl and the petals of a dark cherry dahlia folded into the ugly profile of a man who leaned over and seemed to threaten the rose girl. And so now, so and so now. Either it's my imagination or I'm dreaming, Judy told her. Her heart was pounding against her ribs, and she could hear that resounding pounding. She saw a man standing in a dark corner. Tall, very thin, wearing black clothes that were lost against that background. So clearly she could make out the pale face and the hands, and those eyes, which the darkness had nothing to do with, which glowed of their own accord. She let go of Yuigi's hand, which she found herself clutching, and realized that she had indeed dreamed the whole thing. The hanger was just a hanger with a girl's jacket hanging on it, and that was it. That was it. Judy mumbled in her sleep, like she was talking to someone. Judy reached out to wake her and didn't dare touch her. She was afraid she'd see the unknown man again. The next day, time passed quickly. They both nearly overslept. Judy was hurriedly packing for the funeral. Yugi just shook her head when Judy asked her if she wanted to go. It's not my place. I don't have to go to the cemetery. Just yesterday, Judy thought she'd have as hard a time at the funeral as she had before. Not only would she feel sorry for the relatives, but she would also mourn her own loss. This time, however, she was able to work. She didn't dare go to Sam's mother. The woman could barely stand on her feet, but she talked to her sister, to her fiancé, and to her surprise, she noticed that they were grateful to her. Sasha is gone forever, but Judy is involved in what will remain a memory. She will write the article, people will read it, the family will keep the newspaper clipping even as it yellowed with time. When the mourning part of the ceremony was over and the many wreaths covered the fresh hill, Edgar approached Judy. Are you going to the wake? He asked. Judy saw a way out that he hadn't forgotten about her. I have to get back, she said. And Edgar, if I tell you one thing, will you promise not to share it with anyone? I could sense how intrigued he was. At first he wanted to ask something, but then he just nodded. Remember you told me yesterday about the girl, Yugi? Well, she's staying in my room. Can you pull up to the hotel so that we can get out and somehow get into your car without anyone noticing? We need to get out of town. I understand. It's a long way to my house and not in your old Victory, but at least somewhere to the neighboring village so that there we could take a bus or an electric train. Did Yuji kill anyone? Not really, but she's afraid of it about herself. Can you help me? Not a problem, he said firmly. And don't insult my old lady. I'm dusting her off. She's upbeat and cheerful. So I'll get you where you need to go, and I'll pay you whatever you say. Okay, he said, let me drop you off at the hotel first. And while you're getting ready, I'll stop by the cafe for a minute. Otherwise, Sam's family won't understand. They'll be offended. I mean, we've been friends for years. Yuji had nothing to pack. She just waved her hands when Judy told her to see if she'd forgotten anything in her room. You know, Judy said, I believe you now. Yugi shuddered. He came in the night, didn't he? What were you dreaming about? I thought you were about to start screaming in your sleep. You don't know everything yet, said Yugi. I'll tell you later, because I can't do it alone anyway. Judy locked the room and caught herself taking Yuji's hand like a little girl. They walked down the hotel corridor with Yuji's hand in hers, but Judy didn't see any otherworldly entities. They didn't get home until late in the evening. Judy appreciated Edgar's tactfulness. When Yuji first got into the car, he said hello and didn't ask any more questions. The girl was surprised too. At first, Judy had pegged her as one of those who just couldn't keep quiet, whose mouth wouldn't shut. But Yuji was quiet the whole way, leaning on her arm and looking out the window, and Judy never once caught her burning gaze. When the car pulled up outside Judy's driveway, the time was nearing 11, and it was impossible not to suggest that Edgar stay the night. Judy did so, but the man refused. He'd barely make it back in time for work in the morning. What about? Judy began. She was about to ask how to work after a sleepless night, but Edgar understood her without words and only softly grinned. I'm an ambulance driver, and we're short-staffed as it is. There's no one to replace me. Judy realized that she was sorry to part with Edgar. She felt more at ease with him. She hoped that Yuji hadn't dragged a ghost tale into her apartment. Judy had a 2-bedroom apartment, but since Mike and Lillian had died, she'd only occupied one room, the big one dividing it into 2 parts with curtains. There was a sofa and armchairs by the door, and a coffee table where, if anything, she could. If Judy had occasional visitors, they sat there, and by the window, a bed and bookshelves. A lonely woman's home. Judy had turned the small room that had once been her and Mike's bedroom into a kind of memorial. Even her mother-in-law had told her that she should give away almost all of her clothes, men's and children's, and take the toys to the kids at the boarding school. Judy couldn't even get rid of the old, trampled slippers that Mike loved. She was going to put Yuji on the sofa, but she entered the small room without hesitation and froze on the threshold. It was as if there was company gathered here, and Yuji was waiting to be introduced. She squinted her eyes at the pictures and drawings on the walls, and then began to say something in a whisper, touching both the pictures and the drawings with her slender fingers. "Oh, do you see someone?" Judy asked in a whisper too. Judy didn't answer, or maybe she just didn't hear. But a little later, she turned to Judy and raised her eyebrows questioningly. "What? You can see them, can't you?" Judy's voice sounded almost envious. "And if I touch you, maybe I'll see them too." Yuji blinked, as if waking up. "I just told them that you'll be fine too. Do you have any food?" "I don't know," Judy said. "I always forget about it." She opened the refrigerator in the kitchen and looked around at the empty shelves. Judy followed her and glanced over her shoulder. "Yeah," she summarized. "There's nothing for the mice to hang themselves on. No rope, no soap." "Wait," Judy, remembering something, looked in the freezer and pulled out a packet of dumplings. She showed it to Yuji, almost triumphantly. "Will that do?" It had been a long time since Judy had had such a late-night impromptu dinner. Maybe only when Mike was courting her. And they'd come back when the last movie was over, hungry for food and even hungrier for each other. It wasn't lonely with Yuji around, and Judy had been afraid to get a cat. Now, instead of a cat, Yuji had a cat of her own. Judy made a bed for her on the couch. "Oh, it's a good thing you don't have a closet," Yuji told her. "Amy, I have a closet. You might think someone lives in there too." "Oh, and I'm pregnant," Yuji said flatly. Judy didn't get it at first, and then she lay there for a while, digesting the information. "And who?" She couldn't resist the question, though she didn't want to ask it at first. "I don't know." Yugi's voice was bitter behind some of the bravado. "I can be driven to anyone by the night. What do you think you're going to do?" The room was dark, but Judy thought she saw Yugi's shoulder twitch. It was another who the hell knows in an answer to her question. Here's what must have been unspoken before. Here's what she should help her with. In the weeks and months that followed, the staff at work, and even the editor, who didn't care about the journalists' personal lives, noticed that Judy had changed. She had lost weight and aged outwardly, looked like she was after a serious illness, was perpetually preoccupied. But she was coming back. Judy no longer ran to the bathroom when sobs came to her throat to cry without witnesses. She was no longer a source of pity. Judy worked almost as she had before, no longer turning down assignments because she couldn't take them. She took work home and often sat at the computer until late at night. She needed more money than she had before, but she couldn't force pregnant Yuji to work, especially since she would have gone to look for a job as a restaurant singer without thinking about how her appearance would change in a few months. Good at least agreed to register in the antenatal clinic. But what to do with this girl who has butterflies in her head? Judy liked Yuji at Judy's. First of all, no criminals were looking for her. Secondly, and most importantly, she hadn't seen anyone here, no one scaring her at night, much to the disappointment of Judy, who longed to hear from her own. But Yuji sat at home all day and eventually got bored. "Beak, I've never been abroad," she said to Judy. "Everyone else has, but I haven't. I'll have this baby, get a job, and let's go off with you to the end of the world." Judy just sighed. Then a thought occurred to her. She had a friend in Germany, an oddball man she'd met in a chat room and had been corresponding with for several years, without any backward thought. Judy had a family at the time, and he had no wife but 5 children. The wife demanded a divorce and then married someone else. Maybe she fell in love, or maybe she just wanted to get rid of a bunch of them. During the time they talked, Judy remembered the German she'd learned in school. And Willie had learned a little Russian. He was best at words with a rumbling, rolling R in this. Kashmar, ERA. Katastrofa. Judy knew Willie was a weirdo because he lived his life traveling around to different towns and showing tricks. And he seemed to be looking for a nanny for his boys. Judy even conceded that a nanny who would have a child of her own would be taken for granted by Willie. Of course, she doubted Yuji's aptitude for such labor, but what the hell? There must be some maternal instinct in that girl, too, she said to Yuji. "Let me introduce you to someone. If it works out, maybe he'll call you up later." Judy didn't expect her suggestion to hit the mark. Or rather, she didn't expect it to have such an effect. Willie had lost his head over a blonde with a model's looks, and she was as spontaneous as a child. It was a mystery to Judy how they managed to explain themselves. Yuji was completely incapable of learning a dozen words. But now she had a job to coming home from work. Judy could hear Yuji laughing, her voice animated. "Oh, did Willie hire someone to do the simultaneous translation?" she asked in passing. "You know, he doesn't seem to care what I say." Yuji opened her eyes even wider. "He just likes to listen to me." "Oh, but has he promised you anything yet?" "He wants to invite you to sit with his boys." "Nope," said Yuji. "I mean, of course he did. But just to visit. Boy, he treats me like a queen," she cursed. It happened to her when she was excited, and Judy couldn't stop it. "Wait, what about the baby? He's inviting you in with the baby." "I was holding the camera so he couldn't see I was pregnant," Judy admitted. "It's too early to think about going anyway. I'll have the baby." A year ago, Judy thought she'd be spending New Year's Eve in a cemetery with her family, like that poignant painting of the old woman at the snow-covered grave. And she, too, would come to her own, bring them a little Christmas tree, light candles. Instead, she stood under the windows of the maternity hospital. Because of the quarantine, all visits were canceled, but Yuji climbed up on the windowsill, stuck her head out the window, and she and Judy talked as if nothing had happened. It didn't bother Yuji at all that other women's families were nearby with flowers and balloons. "Oh, see, I had an exemplary labor," she boasted. "I didn't even squeak once. The doctor said to me, 'Everyone should be like you.' But then I lay down. I couldn't get up. I had no strength. I felt so dry, as if I had been drinking all night, and next to it is a sink, and water is dripping out of it. I wondered how I could crawl to it." Judy shook her head. Yuji was incorrigible. What she didn't know was that there was one thing the girl hadn't told her. She had a premonition of it, but she didn't want to believe it would happen. During these months, she had rested her soul at Judy's. She had not left the house on purpose, so that she would not see anything terrible, not to allow the otherworldly to come to her. And at home, the walls became her own. But here, in the delivery room, there he was. Maybe that's why Yuji lost her voice and didn't squeak at the doctor's words. And the scariest moment was when Black walked over and put his hand on her baby, a tiny newborn baby girl. The baby didn't scream. She didn't make a sound at all. Both the pediatrician and the nurses were doing something there, exchanging quick, anxious phrases. Yuji didn't understand them. She only noticed that the baby's hand that came into her field of vision was not pink as it should have been, but purple. The Black man turned his face toward Yuji, and she saw his metal-colored eyes again and his unnaturally bright pupils. How do they manage? All the people crowding in here, not to notice him. How do they not realize he's come for her baby? This is what he'd been waiting for all this time. This is the sacrifice she had to pay for the gift of clairvoyance. Yuji lay there, unable to move, numb with terror, realizing that she had no control over anything because it was always the way he wanted it. The Black man from her nightmare, and then the little girl raised her hand. One might have considered her movement normal for a child, but that was not what Yuji saw. She was far from any kind of faith, but now it seemed to her that it was a gesture of forgiveness, of blessing, and for the first time in Yugi's memory, this man, this creature that had kept her in suspense for years, began to disappear before her eyes. There was no outline of the figure, only black smoke, or maybe it was darkening in her eyes. Yugi blinked. Now she saw only the doctors, the lamp, the table, and her girl finally cried. And it was the usual cry of a baby. What? She just said that. Edgar couldn't believe it. Yes, Judy confirmed. She gave me the baby like a bouquet of flowers. This is my gift to you for all you've done for me. And she went off to get a passport. In a hopscotch. So what are you going to do? Edgar asked cautiously, just in case she signs a waiver. The girl still has a grandmother, quite young. Judy has the wind whistling between her ears, but it's probably better to give the child to her grandmother than to an orphanage. Judy didn't know how it happened, but all these months she and Edgar had been returning phone calls or emails from time to time, and their relationship grew more and more trusting. Even with her co-workers in the newsroom, Judy wasn't as frank as she was with this man who lived so far away from her. I asked her another way. Judy confided, if you give up the little one, would your mother want her? And Yugi just waved her hands, saying, Mom's happy I didn't go down the wrong road. She's put her life on me, and she was sure I'd gotten into something bad. And now I have to take responsibility for my granddaughter. No way in hell. In short, Yugi is confident that everything will work out. And she doesn't think about how you'll get out of it. With such a small child, you should stay at home and you're working. But for the first time, Edgar could hear the excitement in Judy's voice. I'll make it work. I'll take a vacation, and then I'll take a leave of absence. And then maybe I'll take a freelance job so I can work from home. What's the baby's name? Edgar asked, giving up Elena, but not Lillian. Judy's voice didn't even waver because, at home. She'll be Lilia, and on her birth certificate, it'll say Helen Miller. Judy left as soon as the formalities were settled. The social services ladies tried to persuade her not to leave her daughter an orphan, but Yuji looked at them as if they didn't realize the obvious. I didn't give birth for me. I gave birth for her, and with the same ballpoint pen she used to sign the papers, she pointed to Judy. That's her daughter. Eventually, they gave up on her. At first, Yuji called often. She told me that Willie's family had welcomed her as their dearest guest, that she'd quickly bonded with everyone and even learned how to do magic tricks, that the boys had grown fond of her and their father. Then came the picture, Yugi in a pink dress down to the floor and next to a radiant Willie with a bouquet of flowers. From then on, the calls were less and less frequent. Yugi was growing into her new life. She even learned to speak some German. By summer, life was back on track. Judy was freelancing for a living. It became clear that until the baby grows up at least a little, going to work is out of the question. The days flew by before you knew it. And if occasionally there was a spare moment, Judy drew. A childhood hobby resurrected. But now she was drawing strange subjects, futuristic landscapes, mesmerizingly beautiful worlds. Roger invited Judy and the baby to stay with him for the summer. It's so quiet and the air is so nice, he wrote, that you can walk with the stroller all day long. And then it will be good to settle down somewhere by the river. Leia will fall asleep, and you and I will talk as much as we like. I didn't expect to miss you so much. There was no more memorial in Judy's apartment. She'd given the little room to the girl, and now it was a child's world. A crib under an air canopy, a table, diapers, bottles, toys. One sunny May morning, hearing that the girl was awake, Judy entered her room and stopped on the threshold. Leia was looking somewhere in the corner of the room and laughing, and as if trying to talk to someone. Judy shifted her gaze, but there was no one there, just wallpaper with balloons painted on it. Judy went over and took the girl in her arms, and the moment she touched the baby's warm body, the same thing happened as when she had taken her mother's hand the night before at the hotel. Only now it wasn't dark and scary, but blissful. Holding Leia in her arms, Judy looked where the little girl was looking. See, the very beautiful worlds she had drawn were now before her. The trees in bloom and the pink glades, the wind carrying the petals, and she could open her arms like wings and fly with them. Judy saw her husband and daughter, who had settled forever in these worlds of fairy tale beauty, and their souls were happy here. and the hour will come when she will come to them, even if it is still many years away, but this meeting will be undoubted. And knowing this, one can walk along the road of life easily and with a smile, no matter how this road may be.